Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And it's now time for the annual countdown of my favorite releases of the past year. Top 10 best albums of 2018. 2018 has been a pretty solid year for electronic music, I'd say. While I don't think the standouts from this year were quite as huge as some from previous years, and I do feel like I gave out way more sixes this year than any previous ones. Maybe more because I got acclimated to the fact that my rating scale has kind of always been lighter than pretty much all the other reviewers I follow, and I tried to correct myself a little bit. I gave one new album a score in the 9 range this year, but even that one I think I mentioned in the video was inflated by fanboyism and astonishment that it existed at all, and would probably be an 8.7 if I covered it now. But I also feel a lot more confident in my picks this year. Last year I gave shoutouts to Carbon-Based Lifeforms and Spangle, who released really good things, but didn't go the extra mile for me in any way, and haven't really stuck with me in the long term. This year didn't have any lasting 9 out of 10s, but it had a whole bunch of 8s that I still really stand by. 2017 had a couple of 7s in the main list. 2018 has all 8s, and even a bunch of 8s I had to cut. Now sure, some are pretty obvious picks. Spoilers, the people who I use as the buffer music for this list every year, and the people on this t-shirt will be appearing on this list if that wasn't already freaking obvious. But there were a couple of more obscure picks and surprises I've run into over the course of this past year too. Maybe not all the picks will be that predictable. Whatever the case, these are the albums that I most want to keep around the memory of into the future. The ones that left the strongest impression on me or stuck around the longest, the ones that most helped make this year easier to get through, and let's get into them. Disclaimer that this is my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. I obviously haven't heard every single album that came out this year, but these do happen to be my personal favorites that I have heard in the past 12 months. And of course, as always, since I'm the electronic guy around here, all the albums on this list are electronic albums. So, yeah, let's finally get into the top 10 best albums of 2018, specifically the electronic ones. So, as always, before we get into the list proper, here's the honorable mentions. Not put in any particular order, by the way. Honorable mention number 1, Nightmares on Wax, Shape the Future. Ah yes, this guy. This was one of the first releases I covered this year, and it was a pretty quick favorite, being the big Nightmares on Wax fan that I am. Now, it didn't make the list proper, mainly because there are some tracks that are way better than others, and I rarely listen to the entire thing without skipping some of the weaker tracks, like Tell My Vision I don't usually have the patience for. But the best stuff is still among the best he's ever done. Back to Nature, the title track, Got a Smile on It, Maestro, Deep Shadows, and especially Citizen Kane have all really stuck with me. Still a really solid album. Honorable mention number 2, Juno Reactor, The Mutant Theater. Good to see Juno Reactor still around and doing the stuff they do best. This wasn't anything I hadn't heard from them before, but I enjoyed pretty much every track on here and had a ton of fun with it. Definitely worth a shot. Honorable mention number 3, Solar Fields, Hourdom. And speaking of really solid comebacks, the blend of new age and post-rock influences provided an interesting twist on Solar Fields' usual style, and even if it's not the most original take on these sounds, I think he executed them really well and created a really well-paced, varied, and cohesive experience. It's some very nice stuff. Honorable mention number 4, Fortet, with Live at Funkhaus Berlin 2018. Hey, hey, hey. Hey, hey, hey. Literally the only reason this isn't on the list proper is because it's a live album and every track on here he'd already released on his last couple of main albums, but man, oh man, if I were counting this, it'd be pretty damn high up because this concert was absolutely freaking incredible. And especially since it works with some of my least favorite albums of his. If you recall, I found his last album, New Energy, to be a general disappointment, but hearing the tracks from that album in this context really got a strong visceral reaction out of me and were among my favorite moments on here. And the stuff I already like got even better, like Jesus Christ, don't even get me started on the new mix of Morningside. God damn. The way this concert turned tracks I was mostly ambivalent on into something really special, I had to highlight. Direct redemption for some of his more disappointing releases, and one that even got me to appreciate New Energy for what it was. So yeah, definitely don't miss it if you're a Fortet fan. Oh, you probably haven't. Honorable mention number 5. Gas. Roush. I think this was actually a better album than the one that actually did make my list last year, Narcopop. I really think the atmosphere is a lot darker and more uncomfortable, and I like how it takes the Gas sound into new territory that's pretty noticeably distinctive from previous albums, but still unquestionably sounds like Gas. Admittedly not one I returned to a lot over the course of the year, but still one I enjoyed a lot. And I think it's a good sign that despite my belief that this is an improvement from Narcopop, that this didn't make the list. Just means there were more albums this year that I thought were worth keeping and highlighting. You know, this is a good one. Honorable mention number 6. Object. Cocoon Crush. This one just barely missed the cut. Let's say it's my number 11 pick. Really neck and neck between this and my final pick for the number 10 slot, but whatever. This is a freaking great album. The sound design and production on this album is absolutely stellar, with the organic feel you typically see out of the future sound of London, with a modern clarity and dark edge that FSOL themselves don't typically bring. We'll definitely have to keep this one in my mind as a particular standout. Honorable mention number 7. Shifo with Ambiguous Stimuli EP. So now we're in the obscure Bandcamp artist section, I guess. Been exposed to a few more of these than usual this year thanks to Patreon, but here's one I knew from my YTP stuff. Even met him in person once. So this guy's a progressive house artist trying to make something that I guess could someday fit on the Mousetrap label, I guess. Pretty derivative, but I think he's got some real potential. His production is pretty consistently good and fun to listen to, and this was my personal favorite of his releases so far. Only reason I haven't given him a proper video is that he doesn't have any releases so far that have more than 3 tracks and give me more than like 2 sentences to say about it. Whenever he decides to drop a proper album, I will likely be covering that, but anyways, he's good. Check him out. Honorable mention number 8. Punch Cards with Indigo Beats. Another obscure artist that I guess got a tiny bit of traction in the past couple of months. Small-time IDM techno artist that had a pretty fun release here. Pretty energetic, but also pretty dark and edgy, but not in a cringy way. And thankfully doesn't sound just like a straight rip-off of a more established artist like a lot of these IDM obscure Bandcamp artists tend to be. Maybe not the most amazing thing I've heard in my entire life, but pretty refreshing as far as obscure Bandcamp artists go. I thought it was worth highlighting. It's not bad at all. Honorable mention number 9. Eric Texan, Telecommunications. This guy released a lot of different stuff this year, but this was probably my personal favorite of his many releases in 2018. It's my kind of ambient music. I felt it was worth highlighting. So yeah, that's the honorable mentions. Those are all some pretty solid picks. Now let's get into the list proper. Number 10. DJ Rum, or DeJrum, Portrait with Firewood. So we're starting out this list with one that I discovered via a paid request from Patreon. Still got a big pile of those requests I still need to fulfill. But yes, it's a good thing I didn't miss this one because it's one I had a ton of fun with. A lot of interesting and hard-hitting UK garage type stuff in some areas, going up against all this lush and organic live instrumentation. Sounds like if Burial wanted to evoke the atmosphere of some hoity-toity art gallery. This whole thing sounds fantastic from front to back and fits together really well as a whole. Kind of thing I just gotta listen to in one go every time or it's not as special. And despite all the ideas here, probably having been done before by a wealth of other artists, the particular execution on display here is unique and creative enough to set itself apart as its own thing. If you missed out on this one, definitely make sure you pick it up. Number 9. Mr. Fingers with Cerebral Hemispheres. Yeah, this one. This is one I never would have expected to show up. Larry Heard's long overdue comeback, I think, may very well be his best album to date. And it's not one that I can easily illustrate why by showcasing any one individual track. All of these are really subtle deep house pieces that can often be a bit background music-ish, but what really makes this thing special is the variety and pacing. The way it goes through so many facets of Larry Heard's sound and never gets boring or makes any transition that feels jarring. It has vocal tracks and instrumentals, tracks with a smoother and jazzier flair, tracks with much more electronic sounds and acid house grooves, tracks that are more laid back or ambient centric, or tracks that get your foot tapping a bit more. I don't think there's any track I absolutely love just purely out of context, but the experience created by all 18 of them together is super well executed and never at any point boring despite the subtlety of the actual sounds explored. This is an album I found myself returning to a lot over the course of this past year and consistently had fun with. I feel like if you've never heard anything from this guy who's so often credited with inventing the deep house genre in the first place, this is a good place as any to start since it delivers all the styles he's done before and shows him in top form the whole way through. So yeah, awesome stuff. Number 8. Gabriel Lamar with Among Trees I Want to Live. Well, here's one that snuck in kinda last minute. Or at least I reviewed it pretty last minute. I wasn't sure for a while whether or not this was going to have enough staying power with me to really want to highlight beyond a brief mention in this video, but at this point I can definitively say it has. One of the releases from this guy that's been the easiest to return to for repeat listens. It basically delivers everything I'd want out of this kind of dub techno release. Lots of strong grooves and top-notch sound design as Gabriel Lamar has always been able to deliver, but more importantly, plenty of variety for each of the 8 tracks on here to feel distinct from one another. Some more down-tempo centric moments with more of a focus on strained instrumentation and sound design, and some more techno-centric moments which are all about danceability and not much else. A lot of these tracks run really long, but none of them actually feel like they are, and it all fits together under a kind of forest-inspired vibe, I guess. I mean, if you've never heard of Gabriel Lamar, or you have found him interesting but found his insanely huge back catalog to be too intimidating, definitely pick this one up. Not only does it do a great job summing up all the different appeals to his particular style, it consistently delivers some of his best work to date, so yeah, definitely don't miss this one. Number 7. Nils Frahm with All Melody. Ah yeah, this one. This is kind of an interesting one because it's actually really cooled on me in the past couple of months. Halfway into this year, this was easily my number 1 pick for Album of the Year, and I loved every single second of it. Found it to have a lot of emotional depth and use fairly minimalistic arrangements to really strong effect, and have enough variety to keep me interested the entire time. It doesn't excite me as much now. Mainly just because I listen to it so much that I've ended up getting sick of it. And some weaknesses have started to show up, like its consistent focus on really subtle and minimalistic stylings that make it the kind of thing I gotta be in a certain mood for it to get the most out of it, and its long running time that may not have been as well justified as even previous entrants on this list. The instrumentation is a lot more varied and dynamic than Nils Frahm was able to deliver in previous offerings, but before this his work was primarily solo piano, so that's not saying a whole lot. Something like John Hopkins' Singularity uses really similar arrangements but has a much more impressive command of sound design. But I've barely returned to Singularity after my review, it's not on this list, and All Melody kept me coming back well after the fact. For an artist who I was barely familiar with at all before this year, this thing has really lodged itself into my life in a big way. I almost feel like I've known this album forever even though I only heard it for the first time less than a year ago. The arrangements may not be the most exciting or envelope-pushing, but they really stuck with me from an emotional level, and the best stuff from this album, like Human Range, Momentum, and Forever Changeless, haven't lost any of their impact despite my personal overplay. If you want something on the more subtle and minimalistic side, All Melody is definitely one you shouldn't miss, and it's one that had so much personal impact this year, I couldn't go without highlighting it on this list. Number 6. Ski Mask with Compro. Of all my picks on this list, this is the one I think is most likely to show up on other people's lists. It's gotten a ton of buzz from tons of people I've seen around me, both in the electronic music world and from those less focused on this genre, which is kind of interesting to me because it feels like this dude basically popped up from completely out of nowhere. He did have one album before this, but he's really not that well established, doesn't have that much under his belt, he's not signed to a big cult favorite label like Warp or R&S or Ghostly or Ultimate or any of a number of those names. People just really loved this album and its exploration of all branches of electronic music, and it spread really quickly, mainly out of word of mouth. And yeah, the hype is totally deserved. This album blends so many tried and true formulas in the ambient techno world and creates a super well-paced and varied experience with some really captivating and beautiful atmosphere, each track feeling really distinct in their own right, and it's one that keeps me returning to it over and over and never really getting sick of it. If you missed that one, which seems less likely to me than back when I reviewed it, definitely make sure you remedy that. Number 5. Break Science, Grid of Souls.
So basically, there it is and there it goes. I passed this time, but next lifetime, who knows?
More commercial styles of EDM don't typically make this list for me. It tends not to be my thing as much as, stuff that more emulates 90s styles or goes in a more out-of-the-box direction. But goddamn, this album was really something special. Break Science's debut album from 2013, Seven Bridges, already scraped the bottom of my favorites of all time list, but Grid of Souls, despite a clear shift in focus towards this flashier and more commercial sound, may be just as good, if not even better, with ridiculously top-notch production, hooks that really stick with me on pretty much every track, and most importantly, surprisingly high replay value. I don't think I would have believed when this album dropped in March that I'd still be regularly listening to it and getting just as much out of it all the way into December, but here we are. This thing hasn't remotely gotten old. It's a blend of the usual, more psychedelic and hip-hop and jazz-influenced styles that I so often see in the scene that Break Science hail from, with this kind of bright and shiny EDM, make for some of the most memorable compositions in that scene maybe ever. This one may have flown under a lot of people's radar, but make sure you go check it out at your earliest convenience, even if you don't think this kind of thing is usually for you. This was awesome. Number 4. The Orb. No sounds or out of bounds.
Now, easy on the onions.
Well, this is a pretty predictable choice, being the longtime Orb fan that I am. It's an album that basically celebrates every style and sound the Orb have explored over the nearly 30 years they've been around, but presents it in a super fun and engaging way that I found really entertaining from front to back. Some people called it a complete mess, and I can definitely see where they're coming from, but its jumbled mash of styles only added to the entertainment for me, and the album got even better after I saw the Orb live earlier this year. Sure, it was fun to see them play some old classic tunes like Towers of Dub and Little Fluffy Clouds, but the stuff that I had the most fun with at that concert was the stuff they played from this new album, like Ununited States and Soul Planet and Rush Hill Road and Pillow Fight at Shag Mountain. Surely an album with a track called Pillow Fight at Shag Mountain has to be worth giving a shot, right? Well, I'll freely admit a lot of my love for this album comes directly from fan service, to my being a fan of theirs for so many years, and being really familiar with their previous back catalog. It's one that has so much fun weirdness in it that makes it an absolute blast to listen to. If you're as big of a fan of the Orb as I am, make sure you don't skip this one. Number 3. Hybrid, Light of the Fearless. Ta-da! I think people are probably more surprised that this isn't even higher up on the list, since this is the above-mentioned album that I rated a 9.3 out of 10 when it came out, and while I'll admit it's not as great to me now as it was then, I still love the absolute crap out of this album. But just like with Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen 3 2 years ago, there was a very strong and vocal backlash to this album. People were frustrated that the focus was shifted towards a more pop-oriented style than before, and away from the soundscape-heavy stuff that made them so well-loved initially, with only a single instrumental track long time coming that, in retrospect, isn't nearly as memorable as previous classic hybrid instrumentals. Even if I get this wasn't the album they wanted, I mean, first of all, I should mention that Hybrid have a bonus album in this box set here called Shadow of the Fearless, which has all the soundscape stuff that those people actually wanted. Mostly instrumental stuff. And that collection is now available digitally on Spotify and all the other places, so you don't have an excuse not to listen to it anymore. But never mind that. While I have my gripes with Light of the Fearless itself, God, screw you. The original standard edition of the album is the one that made this list, not the bonus material. Because Hybrid doing poppier and more songwriterly stuff was still ridiculously great. The run this album has from tracks 2 through 7 is just pure gold. Super infectiously catchy tunes that have pop and rock flares but still embody the cinematic style and top-tier sound design that made me a Hybrid fan in the first place. Charlotte Truman's personality is so great to have around and gives these tracks so much life and energy, and the other tracks not in that run are just the ones that already followed the traditional Hybrid sound on their own. I can totally understand if this album wasn't your thing, but incidentally, it was a real light in the dark for me in 2018, especially the track Light Up, which is probably my favorite track of 2018, period. So yeah, here's hoping Hybrid can keep delivering amazing material like this in the future, like I said in the review, even if it means another 8-year wait. If we get stuff as great as this out of them, I will wait as long as they need to take. Though I still hope the wait won't actually be as long next time. Number 2. Orbital. Monsters Exist. Yeah, who could have possibly foreseen that Orbital would make one of my favorite albums of the year? It's not like they're my favorite band or anything. But I mean, I half went into Monsters Exist expecting it to be a big, boring letdown and being their weakest album to date. They were not guaranteed a spot on this list going into 2018. But this far surpassed my expectations, becoming what I believe to be their most interesting and well thought out set of tracks since the Altogether. While it's still not quite up to the insanely high standard I hold up the stuff they made in their prime, it's really damn close. It's an Orbital album that is most special when I just listen to it from front to back. It's one that provided more material to break down and analyze than anything of theirs has had in a long time. And like with The Orb, this album got even better after I finally completed my life a few weeks ago and saw these guys live. They played a whole bunch of random deep cuts from this album, aside from the usual suspects. And all of those hit just as hard as all the old standard classics. Hearing The End Is Nigh play in the encore and feeling like these guys had seen my videos on them and knew that was my favorite track from this thing is one of the emotional high points of my whole life. From a pure emotional level, it basically is my number one. Monsters Exist has to be the album this year that made me the happiest. It totally made my 2018. But it's still not my actual number one pick. Thing is, as much pure joy as I derive from this album, I still don't consider it among the absolute best these guys have to offer, and making them my number one felt like way too obvious a pick held up by a ton of pure fanboyism. There was one album this year that I happen to feel was more worthy of accolades and attention than these guys, who are going to get accolades for me regardless, no matter what. So, how about we get into that final number one pick? Number 1. Michael Menert and the Pretty Fantastics with From the Sea. Monsters Exist may have given me more personal joy than this, but only by a tiny bit. From the Sea, meanwhile, feels like way more of an accomplishment and a labor of love, on top of coming from an artist who I feel deserves more attention in general. From the Sea is Michael Menert pouring out all his heart and soul on top of so much blood, sweat, and tears. It feels like this man's entire life force was put out into this album. I don't get that from Monsters Exist at all. Maybe there's a part of me who kinda wonders whether this even qualifies as electronic enough to top the list of my favorite electronic albums. I mean, it comes closer to jazz and funk and hip-hop, but At the end of the day, who cares? It's close enough. But goddamn, this album is a freaking masterpiece. 17 tracks of this thing. It feels like we are going on a journey through this man's mind and life philosophy, accompanied by absolutely gorgeous production and consistently fantastic performances from the live Pretty Fantastics band. But it's not just the sound design and production I love. Menard himself puts forward some of his best and most memorable hooks he's ever done, and the emotional core and lyrics centered around his particular mindset throughout this past year create this uplifting and life-affirming feeling that still constantly acknowledges the dark and grim reality we live in, and tackles it in a perfectly relatable and realistic way. One moment he can be talking about how the world's gone insane and we all had it coming on where we belong, or his ongoing search for inner peace within himself on solo mission, but at other points he'll just give a simple message to live life to the fullest since you only get one on All You Get, or the simple theme of not giving up through hardships on One More Time. Or sometimes he'll just let the freaking amazing band performances and production get the spotlight on Cannot Be or the immensely impressive title track. Now, the album isn't perfect. There are tracks like Electric and Away that feel a bit superfluous. The former has a bit of a dig at social media I don't really think was necessary, and The Only Thing feels like a story left on a cliffhanger that never gets resolved. But these are basically nitpicks in this album that feels like a giant achievement otherwise. Sometimes I'm just in the mood to listen to certain specific tracks from this thing, or for the sound design, or for the messaging. Sometimes I'm in the mood to hear this whole thing in one unbroken piece. Heck, even when I'm not listening to it, I may end up singing Diamonds in My Pocket or something else from this album to myself. From the Sea is something that totally encapsulates 2018 without actually feeling like it came from this year or any time in particular. It feels timeless to me. And it's the kind of thing that only Michael Menard and his friends here could have delivered. I don't really have much else to add to this. From the Sea by Michael Menard and the Pretty Fantastics is my pick for the best album of 2018. Here's to another year of great music. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next year. Ba-da-ba.